Hello everyone and welcome back on the channel. This is your favorite type of the video lately. It's called step by step, and in the following video, since I got lots of requests in the last couple of weeks, you just want me to teach you how to play Queen's Indian with black. Don't forget, step by step video shows you every single line for a certain opening. For example, if I do the step-by-step video, but I do it in my way, with my choice of the openings and the variations, so hopefully you're gonna find it very useful. I'm pretty sure many of you after this lesson are going to happily wait for the third move, knight f3, because you guys, when you play against Nimzo, it's not a problem. Knight c3, bishop b4, and then you're happy. Even the top guys are happy when they play knight c3, bishop b4. But when third move is knight f3 by white, lots of guys go with d5, going into some sort of queen's gambit type of positions. Here, I'm going to teach you how to play b6, and I'm going to teach you with the choice of my variations, and hopefully you're just going to enjoy it very much. Most of the games that I'm about to show you are based on my own experience and my games. One of my most favorite players, thanks to whom I actually learned the Nimzo opening and the Queen's Indian, it's Michael Adams. Then throughout this file, you're going to find lots of games of Vishy Anand, Vasily Ivanchuk, and a couple of my advanced students. Let's go, enjoy, fasten your seat belts, and it's time for the real thing. After d4, knight f6, c4, e6, just like I told you, even top GMs consider that when white plays knight c3 and you go with a bishop b4, it's Nimzo Indian, and it's considered to be good for black. Okay, we're not also far away from actually doing the Nimzo, but we actually do have the Nimzo here for black. So it's time to cover the third move, knight f3. Usually that's way more difficult because if you go with d5, and that's usually an approach by top players because it's considered to be a good attempt by black to equalize the game, although those are pretty difficult positions to play for a win when white goes with knight c3, or when white goes with, of course, Catalan opening. Then you have c5 type of positions where they can choose to play some g3 going into the English opening, or d5, and then you're forced to play either Blumenfeld gambit with b5, or to play like this and go for nothing else but Benoni defense. No, we won't do any of this. So I just decided to go with b6, which is nothing else but Queen's Indian defense. So it's time for Queen's Indian defense, unlike Nimzo, where after knight c3, bishop b4, it's all about e4 square. In Queen's Indian, it's a little bit different. They don't take like necessarily control of the e4 square, and they play more flexible. You never know whether they want to play g3 or a3. You never know if they would like to develop the dark square bishop on g5 or f4, or even on b2. You never know whether they want to place the knight from b1 to c3 or on d2. That's the flexibility, and at the same time, one of the main advantages of the Queen's Indian by white. Here we have to cover 4 moves. First of all, I would like to remind you that the knight c3 goes into the Nimzo Indian. And when knight c3 happens, it's like 3 knights opening in Nimzo. And if you know my step-by-step video about that, I just said go for bishop b4, where you take full control of the e4 square, where I'm once again going to repeat it just briefly. If they go with a3, you just go with knight e4, pinning this knight. When they play queen c2, defending on c3 and attacking the knight, you just go bishop b7. When they play bishop d3, threatening to take the knight, you take on c3, or you can play f5. It's pretty much the same. And when they play castles, now they really want to take the knight on e4, so you take by bishop, you go with the short castle, and then you go with those attacking possibilities. If the knight stands on f3, you want to play rook g6. If the knight moves from f3, your rook in those cases always goes on h6. In case of bishop g5 instead of a3, I just proposed you in the Nimzo Indian step-by-step video to go with bishop b7, e3 h6, bishop h4 g5, bishop g3, and the specialty for black in this position is to take on c3, even though you're unprovoked to take it, and play d6. By placing all your pawns on the dark squares, you're doing nothing else but fighting against the pretty restricted dark square bishop, and that's one of the main points of Nimzo Indian 3 knights variation, and if they play forward move knight c3. Afterwards, you have a possibility to play knight bd7, queen e7, a traditional older approach, but I actually like to play here much more something with queen e7, flexibility. I'm still not committing myself with either knight c6 or knight bd7. They always go h4, they want to take on g5. You know, you never take, you never push g4. You always go with a flexible rook g8. And when they take, you just capture and your position is nice. That's the point. And then you place your knight on c6 or on d7, followed by long castle, and your position looks good. We're done with the fourth move, knight c3. And once again, I'm just going to redirect you onto the step-by-step video about the Nimzo opening, where you have covered how to play against the 3 knights opening. And that's it. And that's enough about the fourth move, knight c3. We're now going on to the fourth move, e3. e3 is typical Queen's Indian in the Kohli fashion, or some Queen's Indian positions where they just go with this e3, let's just call it a Kohli flexible setup. So you always go bishop e7, they should go with bishop d3, and my vote goes to d5. That's a very nice move. You play d5. Yes, at the moment you do close the light square bishop, but at the same time you break in the center and take full control of the center. I believe that most of your opponents will go with b3, and the real question for us comes now. Should we place our dark square bishop on e7 or on d6? That's the point. Always place it on d6. I insist on bishop d6 much more than anything else. So when they play castle, just remember one thing. Vlad Kramnik played earlier, like 10 years ago, lots of games with c takes d5, e takes d5, and bishop a3. Exchanging the dark square bishop not only gives you like better fight along the c file, but also it weakens the c7 square. And then one just wants to play knight c3, rook c1, and with the knight b5, go after the pawn on c7. This is about to be almost clearly better in some variations for white, but when they go for bishop a3, you just have to go with c5 and to say, no, I don't want to exchange this. So after knight c3, knight bd7, rook c8, rook e8, usually you place your rooks like this, and when you play c5, you have that sort of flexibility typical for these type of games, and black is absolutely fine. In case they go castle, and instead of c takes d5, bishop e2, so they keep like the flexibility, I always suggest you to go with knight bd7, and when they go knight c3, because they want to play c takes d5, rook c1, and knight b5, going after both bishop d6 and pawn c7, you go a6, securing position for your bishop. And take a look at this one. Why did we play knight bd7? Because we wanted to keep the light square bishop open. Why? Because we want to jump like we're doing it here and doing it now with the knight on e4. So take a look at this symmetry of the game. Take a look at the activity of the bishop on b7, its role of defending that knight on e4. And in this type of games, you have lots of plans. Let me just show you 3. You have actually 4. You have an idea of breaking c5 afterwards. That's one plan, playing into the center, and let's just say keeping the tangent on the white center. Then instead of c5, you have a possibility typical for Coley type of systems, queen f6 and queen h6. I very much like this one because you have both of these bishops. I'm talking about the d6 and b7 bishops that point out, like straight onto the king side and against the king on g1. Lovely one as well. Then instead of queen f6, you have the third plan. So I showed you c5, queen f6, like go with f5, some sort of Dutch defense, maintaining control of the center. Yes, weakening the e5 square and its control, but at the same time you can just push these pawns onto the king side, play some rook f6 or queen f6 afterwards, and do typical Dutch attack on the king side. And finally, there is a fourth plan, which is queen e7, flexible approach. Sometimes you want to play f5, sometimes bishop a3, sometimes c5. This is like a flexible plan for black. So I explained you all these plans. I gave you what to do against the fourth move a3, and it's time to check two main moves, a3 and g3. By the way, when it comes to g3, we're still not there. I'll have to show like a whole bunch of lines, so it's not going to be easy. And this a3, it's called Petrosian's line. And let me just explain you the point of Petrosian's line. The point of a3 is not to ever give you any more possibility to pin the knight with any bishop b4. These guys hate to be pinned with the bishop b4, and that's why they go with a3 move. Throughout my chess career, I played both of these moves, bishop a6 and bishop b7, and somehow I am more for bishop a6 moves. In general, the whole lecture about the Queen's Indian and step-by-step that I'm performing here, it relies on bishop a6 ideas for black. I remember when I was younger, I was always wondering why on earth someone plays b6 and then instead of placing bishop on b7, plays the bishop on a6. And that could be the question that could be posted here. Why do you want to play bishop a6 to attack the pawn that can be defended by queen c2, queen b3, knight b2, e3? I mean, what's the point of this? And to be honest with you, at that time I couldn't answer myself. I didn't have those coaches to explain me. There was no YouTube to check it out. So what's the point of bishop a6? Well, you're just forcing this knight. He played a3. So he doesn't want to get pinned with the bishop b4, which means when you play bishop a6 and you force your opponent to go with the knight bd2, he already should be a little bit unhappy with existing knight on d2. And then you can play d5, and then you can play an easy game in the center, and then black is absolutely fine in a game like this. And just like I said, they're not happy to have the knight on d2. Since they played a3, they want to have it on c3. So that's one reason for playing bishop a6. Then there are another two reasons. If they go with e3, it's kind of Coley, Queen's Indian type of setup. You just go with d5. Somehow you immediately go after the pawn on c4 and put some sort of pressure. In a famous game between Nakamura and Adams, played in Tripoli 2004, and Korchnoi against Adams, played in Reykjavik 2003, both of these guys went with some sort of flexible knight b2 and b3. Let me show you this one. Viktor Korchnoi played b3. Why b3? Because he wants to play kind of coolly Tsukirtat with the bishop on a6. And he wants any d takes e4 to answer with b takes e4. So after bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, c5 in this position. What's the point of c5? You're just going, like all in onto the white center with c5. And I very much like these type of games because if our opponents play something like d takes, b takes, c takes, you can play bishop d3, queen to d3, and play like this. Or you don't have to take, you can just take it like this and wait for them to take, in which case your knight goes like this, goes to c7. But to be honest with you, when I have the hanging pawns, I prefer not to exchange too many pieces and to have a game like this. What I'm actually showing you here is playing with the hanging pawns if they take. If they don't take, and they usually don't, then you create a weakness on d4, which is a weak pawn on d4, and then the real question is, should we place this knight on d7 or c6? Even though our bishop stands on a6, I like knight c6, knight bd2, and watch this out. Rook c8, nothing special, but you're fighting against some ideas by white coped with c5. Rook e1, nothing special, you just go with a rook e8. Why? Because a typical way of repositioning the dark square bishop is going with bishop f8, g6, bishop g7, or bishop h6. Rook c1, typical idea of this move is to go with c5 and b4, doing some sort of expansion on the queen side. Bishop e7, the guy plays knight f1. His idea is to reposition this knight to a3 and to have like better control of the center. Michael Adams played bishop f8. Victor Korchnoi played knight g3, which looks okay, but nothing special. And when you play g6, I believe that the pawn on g6 stands very nicely against the knight on g3. And here, in these positions, I analyzed a few games of Vlad Kramnik, who in this position played c5 with the idea of playing b4. And that is very dangerous. If they manage to do c5 and b4, you'll be in serious danger. Because of that, any c5, you play a5. I remember playing against Eduardo Iturizaga in Skopje, I believe it was 2013. I was black. I really had a great position, and when he played c5, this a5 move I learned from Vlad Kramnik in one of his games, and that's a very nice move. You keep the tension on the board. You don't give them to play b4. This is a very nice position. And by the way, on your question, Maya, why some of these guys play a3 in similar type of positions? Because they want to push c5, and after b takes, d takes, they wouldn't have knight b4 attacking the light square bishop and pawn on c5. Okay, for white here, a3 was played way earlier, but any c5, we want to answer with this nice move a5, which is fighting against b4 and further pawn advance by white onto the queen side. After bishop b5, now he just wants to take on c6 and push b4, as well as jumping with the knight on e5 afterwards. And here, Michael Adams played bishop h6, which is okay, but after rook b1, somehow I realized that after bishop c6 and b4, black is hardly going to stop his further intentions. Here, Adams was supposed to play knight d7, taking control of e5 afterwards, unpinning himself because that knight on c6 and rook on e8, they really had problems. And at the same time, you're just threatening to take on c5 with b takes c5. Black would be absolutely fine in a game like this. One more thing, if on bishop a6, a3, d5, they don't play b3, but knight bd2, you just go with bishop e7. What's the point of bishop e7? Watch out. In these type of games where they play b3 and where they play this flexible Kolitsukirta type of games, you go with bishop on e7, c5, this, and you take like this. Can you go with knight c6 in this position? Of course you can. Can you go with bishop on d6 in similar type of positions? Of course you can. This is just like your approach in this type of games. I'm showing you a game from the World FIDE Championship where Nakamura got beaten badly by Michael Adams. Adams played knight bd7, played rook c8, played g6 with a famous idea that I already explained you, restricting the light square bishop, going with some rook e8, bishop f8, bishop g7. But after rook ac1, here Michael Adams came up with move typical for his style. With lots of patience, he played rook c7, queen b8, and rook fc8. After knight f1, bishop f8. After knight a3, controlled square d5. And just like you see, here I'm giving you some games of top players, mainly Michael Adams and his approach. But you just have to know that when you play like this, you have to learn to be positional, patient, to be good in shuffling your pieces around, and to know how to patiently wait for your chance. Okay? And finally, what can be the point of bishop a6 if they just played the queen move, queen c2 or queen to b3? In many of these lines, we want to go with c5. And when we go with c5, they're just going to play some d5. They can easily play d5 with the queen on d1. When the queen stands on c2, d5 is no longer be an option. So let's go. After bishop a6, let's say they go with queen b3. Queen b3 is a specialty of these Russian GMs. Drev, Vityugov, Razhyansev. They used to play that like 15 years ago. But what should you do here? Bishop e7 and break it with d5. They simply have to take it and take by knight. A very simple approach. If they take, you're just going to choose whether you want to take by queen or by pawn. If they push e4, you're first, of course, going to exchange the light square bishops, take on c3, and if b takes c3, play castle, queen c8, queen b7, knight d7, c5. If they take by queen, then you just go this, c5 immediately. And this is a very important positional rule to teach you. When you see that the pawn stands a2 and b2, you usually take by bishop in these positions. But when you see pawns on b2 and a3, you always want to take b takes c5. What's the point? Point is that I want to go with my knight, whether it goes on c6, d7, or sometimes even a6. I'm going to play queen b6, and at some point rook b8 when I get rid of that bishop and f8, and they will have problems with both. Square b3, which is weakened since they committed themselves with a3, and with the pawn on b2. That's a very nice positional thing to learn throughout this lecture. And finally, when they play queen c2, the main line of Petrosian's system goes with the queen c2. So what's the point of queen c2? When they play queen c2, they defend the pawn c4 and threaten to almost win on the spot, I mean positionally, by playing e4. So queen c2, yes, black managed to move the queen from d1. So when we play c5, they won't be able to push d5, or they won't even have that possibility afterwards. I apologize. But when they play queen c2, now they defend the pawn on c4, and they're about to push e4. Since that's the case, we now have to take care of e4. So what do? We bring the bishop back, and the message is clear. White says, okay, I cannot play e4, at least for the temporarily, not even for the time being. So after knight c3, since you don't have bishop e4, now e4 is a real threat. And now you have two approaches. To play d5. Well, guys, if I wanted to play d5, I would have played d5 in the third move, playing the queen's gambit type of positions in its classic mode. I can also fight. That's a direct way of fighting against e4 and white center, but you also have indirectly fighting with c5. I like those kinds of things, and that's one of my most favorite lines. And get ready for some really top-notch analysis here by black. And let me just show you what's happening here. After like c5, I already explained you, when the pawns are on a3 and b2, you always should take by pawn on c5. And after bishop f4, just take a look how black goes with development. You play bishop e7, you play castle, and here, after e3, Michael Adams against Razhyansev played a typical plan. a6, d6, queen c7, so he can look at this. You can develop knight because d6 is hanging. You don't want to play knight c6 because then in that case you close the light square bishop, but then that's why you first play queen c7, get rid of the pressure there with the knight h5, and afterwards you just have a very lovely, very tough position. I mean tough position to crack. But this is not too, I'd say, too exciting for us. So because of that, after d takes e5, b takes e5, bishop f4, bishop e7, e3, I'm suggesting you to go with knight h5 straight away. Now they can play bishop g5. They shouldn't play bishop g3 because we can choose the moment when to take on g3. We don't have to do it immediately. They most likely have to go with this. And I'm showing you one game where the guy went for f5, queen e7, knight c6, knight f6, played rook d8, played the rook b8 because he realized now that the b3 could be weakness, played bishop a8, afterwards went with the rook f to d8, doubled these rooks on the b file, and you know what? In position like this, black was untouchable, but at the same time, somehow it turns out that white clearly had problem with the pawn on b3. That's very interesting. Apart from that, there is another line. There is a gambiting system with d5. I'll be honest with you, and I have to tell you that I lost one game when I was very young. I played one IM tournament. I lost to Yilmaz from Turkey. He really destroyed me tactically in this game, and that's exactly the point of this line. Nowadays, this line cannot be played by white, and let me just teach you the refutation. You take, and now they have a couple of moves. If they go with queen e4, looks like they're winning a piece. No, they're not. You play queen e7. Now I'll show you how Vichy Anand beat Bosboom in Vaikanze in 1999. The guy played a very attractive, but seemingly not enough, queen d5, bishop d5. Vichy Anand brought it back, defended himself. He's even ready to give another exchange back, in which case he would be completely winning in position like this. This guy didn't fall for that, play d4 to go with bishop c4 now. And after d6, bishop b5, rook c8, h4, king f7, Vichy Anand won this game afterwards. Very lovely game. The way he played this game and the way he defended himself, it comes to me like very natural and more like cold-blooded defense by black. After queen e4, queen e7, if they play knight e5, I found 10 games in the database, you just play queen e6, and now you defend on d5, and you just want to play f6, winning the piece afterwards. So it's very simple for your opponents to make mistake if they play queen e4, and that's why they go with bishop g5. Even that guy against me did this bishop g5. I played bishop e7. And let me just show you something thanks to which I won a couple of nice blitz games. I was taught this by Serbian GM Grandmaster Marjanovic, who coached me for some time. And in one of his games, I remember he showed me, Maya, do you know what's the point of queen e4, which looks extremely annoying because looks like d5 you're hanging your knight, bishop on b7 looks like you're lost. It's knight c3. And your question, what about this? Because they win the bishop. Knight c6. Point is that none of these guys think of taking by king on e7. And everything is forced because now you gotta take the knight on c3. We play rook b8 and b5 followed by rook b6 and you win the queen. I remember he won few games. I won few games afterwards thanks to this trick. And it's so nice. And it's so easy for your opponents to go into it. Another thing is knight b5. And that line was considered to be extremely dangerous in the past. And after castles, knight to d6. And I found so many games now. Bishop c6, queen c7, or something else. But there is an amazing refutation of this knight d6. It's, believe it or not, this move. Yes, it's knight to e3. 2 exclamation mark moves. If they take by bishop, of course you're going to take on d6 and you're going to have an easy game. If they take by pawn, which happened in game Jangava Chernin, you just take on f3. And when they play takes f3, you take the bishop. And what can I say? With the dark square bishop, king being exposed, pretty weak pawn on e3, there is only one side that can push for a win here, and that's black. Chernin won this game in 19 moves with black. And finally, it's time to check what engine says to be the best move. Knight d5, bishop d5, e4. I checked the game of Hans Niemann, who played recently, actually last year, a game like this. He knew for the best move for black in this position, it's bishop to e6. So he's not bringing his bishop back to b7. It goes on e6, you solidify position of your king, it's defense, and you're just so nice. And after bishop f4, Niemann in that game played normal. Knight c6, bishop e7, queen c8, and castle, which is normal development. His up opponent, he's going to try to defend himself. But I like very much my move. It's a novelty. You just go after the bishop. And when they put it back, you play bishop e7, knight c6. And now, let's go. I'm willing to go with g4, h5, and especially if you play castle, I'm going to do g4, I'm going to do afterwards h4, and I'll be the one who's going to be in the driver's seat in this position. And that's why none of these gambiting stuff, cope with d5, should be working. After c5, they'll go with d4. That's the main move. You take on d4. And here we have 3 moves. Let me just briefly mention what can you play. My choice and my vote goes to bishop c5. That's the main move. But for example, knight c6, bishop c6 used to be one of the main lines for years. I even found a game of Michael Adams against Nana Jagnidze, who played bishop f4, bishop c5, bishop e2 castles, rook d1 a5. And just like you see, Adams is going for full control of the dark squares. But if you ask me, this position looks very difficult for playing and somehow unnatural, especially after e5, where almost instantaneously I would go with knight e8, but Adams went with the knight h5, and when the guy captured, he went with the queen h4, winning back one of those 2 bishops. Another line is d6 instead of knight c6, where after bishop e7, bishop e2, bishop e7, you can go with knight bd7 and play nothing else but a typical Hedgehog position after rook c8, rook e8, queen c7, queen b8, knight c5, and then you just have to decide whether you want to push b5 or d5 afterwards. And finally, just like I said, my vote goes to bishop c5. It's absolutely the main move. You're just harassing this knight. They go knight b3, knight c6. And let me show you what happened in game Rajabov against Adams, played in Prague 2002. Rajabov decided to win the bishop pair, but then when you win the bishop pair, you actually have problems with the d4 square. And all of a sudden, it becomes one of the most important, assets in our game. After bishop d3, short castle, take a look at the plan for black. Because I always had problems till this game to realize how should I play these type of games, because they have potential f4 and d5, they have the bishop pair, somehow it looks very difficult for us. Although, if you just go a little bit deeper into the secrets of these positions, you're just going to realize it's not so difficult for playing. So let me just show you what's happening there. After castle, you play d6. It's nice, it's flexible. Then I say, okay, but what if I play f4 and I just need to push somehow at some point d5 and you're dead? h6, precaution measures, I don't know, just not to have some e5, bishop h7 at some point. Then this guy plays queen d1. The real question of queen d1 is Rajabov trying to push some g4 or to prevent something? Or maybe he's just fighting for something on the king's side. Michael Adams played rook b8, played bishop e3, played rook e8, played rook to b1. These moves, rook b8 placing on the potentially open file, rook e8. Why rook e8? Because if you ever push d5, e takes, then you will have an open e file. And also, you just want to, play improved position of your rook. After a5, you forever want to avoid b4. For example, that's a difficult idea, because now you forever give up b5 square for the knight. Although that's not a problem. He found a way how to get rid of the weakness on d6, playing e5 and jumping with the knight on d4. Very, very lovely game by Adams. And after bishop c6, take a look at his maneuvering. Rook b6 to be able to play queen b8 or queen c7, queen b7, rook b8. g4 wants to go with g5 and looks terribly difficult. Now Michael Adams went here, went knight g5, placing some pressure against the e4 pawn, playing queen a8, and this is why they call him Spider-Man, because somehow out of nowhere he's just finding a nice way for the counter initiative, and all of a sudden, what is, if you ask me, completely lost. I very much like that game, and I believe that's what you have to follow. Bishop f4 is aimed against some queen c7 ideas, as well as they want to take on d6 and simply stick this bishop onto the d6. If bishop f4 happens, play e5, kick it away, play h6 with tempo, and play castle. After f3, play a5, control the dark squares. Play rook e8, play a4, kicking the knight, and now jump with the knight on d4. This could be applied as a general rule, like you guys used to say, a rule of thumb. When they give up knight for the bishop on c5, first of all, we're not going to run away from giving up the bishop on c5 for the knight on b3. It's even good and lovely for black. Why? Because when that happens, we always have to play knight. First of all, we're getting the d4 square for the knight. That's one thing. And second thing, we're just getting a great game, for our knight, for bishop, for all these pieces. After queen d1, we just play bishop c6, overprotecting a4, controlling both d5 and knight on b5. Knight on d4 is a monster. They can never jump knight d5 or knight b5 because bishop is going to take it, and somehow black looks absolutely fine. Just like you see, also they permanently are going to have problems with the b2 pawn. And finally, if knight b3, knight c6, they just go with bishop g5. On bishop g5, it's very important to remember Etienne Bacro lost to Michael Adams. Adams immediately jumped, which is a mistake, because of knight b5 and now push e5. He lost this game in 24 moves. He was way younger than Adams at that time and way less experienced, and Adams won. Even though this is bad position for black. In mutual complications, he miscalculated something. On bishop g5, you always have to go first with h6. What's the point? Now you play bishop h4, knight e4, and now they shouldn't have that idea with knight b5 because you bring it back and they don't have f4. So what's the point? If knight e4, bishop d4, knight b5, now you can play this because I'm going to play f4 and I'm going to chase it away because the bishop on g5 defends it. Understand the difference. So that's why after bishop g5, you first go h6, now jump knight e4. You threaten to take on c3 and to take the pawn on e4. They got to go bishop d3. And one of the crucial moves is queen b8. I very much like. I even played one tournament game with black pieces. The point of queen b8 is that you don't let them go with a long castle, because then you just give check and boom, you win a piece. So that's why they have to go with bishop g3. And now you're bringing your bishop into e5. And not only that it's backed up by the queen on b8, but at the same time, they won't be able to push f4 easily anymore. After long castles, short castles, king b1, this is a very important position. I played a few blitz games like this, and usually I played rook c8, sometimes I played d6 to recapture by pawn on e5, and those are fine ideas. But actually there is a very nice tactical idea for black here. Even though position looks boring, black has a very nice game. a6. The point of a6, you want to sack that pawn with b5. On your question, how and why? What if they take, play g3 to play f4? Boom. What if they push it, queen c5, they take it, knight b5, and say, okay, I'm up a pawn, let's trade the queens off. Well, yes, but I'm not crazy to trade the queens off. And all of a sudden, you have problems with the pawn on e4, you can't move your queen, I'm going to play rook c8, I'm going to kick your knight away with, I don't know, lots of moves, including, I'm even threatening to take on e4 if I want to immediately make a draw. Knight e4, bishop e4, bishop e4, queen b5. I'm just saying how you react in these positions. After rook h2 e1, b5, c takes, a takes. Now taking on b5, you can just, I don't know, take on, for example, I remember playing a blitz game. The guy played like this. I just played bishop g3 in this position, h takes g3. Actually, rook wasn't there. Then I took on e4 and made even better position in the game. Here, you obviously well, can you play now knight e4? Just let me just see. Bishop rook e4, bishop e4, bishop e4, queen b5. Yes, you can play that. So, and not only that one, you also can go with a line such as bishop e4, knight e4, and then the b5 knight is hanging. Just like you see, that a6 and b5 idea coped with a queen being on the b file is a really nice salvation for black. After queen b3, you take, play d5, and if a takes d5, knight e5, rook a6 to go rook b6. He captured here, defended himself, put a queen into the defense, and he was completely winning. This is an email game played in 2007. A very convincing and pretty smooth win for black. Guys, I showed you like all these type of systems, all these type of ideas. It's time for the main lines in the Queen's Indian. After b6, what's happening when they play g3? Throughout all these years, when I used to play d4 with white pieces, I used to play g3 myself. Of course, that you can absolutely play bishop b7. There is also a move such as bishop b4 here. But just like I said, step by step, those are simple choice of the variations that I picked for you, that I used to teach my students, or I use them throughout my practice and career. So here, just like I told you, I like bishop a6 going after the c4 pawn. And here, we're mainly going for analysis of model games played by Michael Adams mainly, who gave an amazing, examples and simply directions how should we play into these type of games. So I already explained you why do we play bishop on a6, because we want to place this knight on a square where it doesn't belong or where it's not good, knight bd2, because now when they play g3 it would be stupid to play 3, and in case of just queen c2 or queen b3, then once we break at some point with c5, they won't have an easy d5 anymore. But let's go one by one, and we have 5 moves to cover here. Let's go with the least common thing. It's queen to b3. I played already 2 games. I played against Grandmaster Barlov and I won. And I'm gonna give you this game, but I made one suspicious opening move at some point. And I played another game against an IM and I drew it. Why? Because I knew what should be my plan. So I play knight c6. And idea with knight c6 is to go with knight a5, going after pawn on c4. After that, they have 2 moves. Knight bd2, which is the main one, and bishop d2. Barlov against me played bishop d2. I was very happy when I saw that, because I knew a few more moves, and I knew that there are lots of tactical tricks, and he's not going to have an easy time in a position like this. So bringing the bishop back to b7 gives us a very nice tactical threat of knight e4. In game Fominik Sakhaev, Fominik is a pretty strong GM from Russia. That guy played like 25 years ago d5. That's a weak move. You bring it back, you pressure the pawn. They can't wait, they cannot defend it, they gotta take. You recapture by f-pawn, getting a full flexibility of our pieces. And very important, open f-file. Now it sounds like, what the hell is this guy talking about? But let me just show you. Bishop g2, knight f5, castles, bishop c5. All of a sudden, 4 of your minor pieces look very powerful here. He completes his development, short castle, queen c2, bringing the queen back into the game, and now Sakhaev came up with queen e8. He just wants to do some sort of Grand Prix idea coped with queen h5 and knight g4. That's what I like about this position. The game was bishop g5, knight g4. He sacrificed, played knight g3, brought it back, played queen h5. He had a great initiative and eventually won the game. So d5 after bishop d2, bishop b7 doesn't seem to be working. I remember that Barlov against me played bishop c3, defending on d4. Then I played knight e4. My idea was to take on c3, and if you take by knight, knight e4. If you take by pawn, knight a5. If you take by queen, bishop e4, I pin the queen and I win the queen. So that's why after knight e4, believe it or not, they have to play a3. That's the only move. And the point of this move is very simple. When I take, of course, you can't take by knight because of knight e4 and the rook is hanging. And of course, they have to take by queen, in which case we don't have any more bishop b4. I played a game here and I played queen f6. Simply, I played queen f6, d6 and d5, and it wasn't like the happiest solution. I won the game against the GM. It was a tournament game, but I'm not too, I'd say proud of that game because I was worse. After queen c3, you play bishop e7. Point of bishop e7 is to go with the bishop on f6, threaten to take on d4, and play c5, pinning that knight. And now, let me show you. If e4, you just play bishop f6, a beautiful move. I have to emphasize the importance of this one, and when I said get ready for some real stuff, I really meant that. So when you go with bishop f6, one might say, what the hell? I mean, how can you play bishop f6? The guy is going to push the pawn on e5 and that's going to be easy job. No, that's going to be easy job, but for us. Boom! 94, opening up everything, and he's just completely lost in a game like this. What a powerful tactics. Then you say, okay, Maya, calm down. I'm going to play bishop g2, and then you have nothing. Are you sure, buddy? Knight takes d4. They do go for this, c5, and then we're opening up a game. They can't push e5. We ended up having the bishop pair. Great control of the dark squares, even one on d4 a pawn, and black is so much better according to the engine it's winning. That's why they play queen to d3, overprotecting the center, unpinning from the pin of the bishop, and giving himself knight c3. After g5, the point of this move is to always have possibility to bring the bishop back here. I still believe that after this, you can just go with this and win the game. Nice tactics. So after g4, bishop g7, queen f6, d6, and Kunte, Abhit Kunte, GM from India, managed to relatively easy win this game afterwards. Why? He doesn't have weaknesses, and from another point of view, he's got an advantage of the bishop pair. So I just showed you what to do against these lines. Apart from sixth move bishop d2, they can also play knight bd2. When they play knight bd2, they just develop peace and overprotect the pawn. You just go knight a5, and the point of this move is if you go queen c2, I go c5. If you go queen a4, I first, since you threatened before to win my piece, one of these two pieces, I first bring my bishop back and control e4, and then after this, I'm breaking with c5. And finally, if queen c3, that's a typical line. You play c5, of course, otherwise they just threaten to play b4 and b5 and to win one of these two pieces. So watch out, b4 is a threat here. You go c5, which avoids b4, obviously. d takes, b takes, and on e4 you go bishop b7 and jump with the knight on e4. Knight on e4 is doing a great job. They take, bringing the knight back, playing bishop e7 and playing bishop on g6. I remember playing these positions in few training games against a couple of my students. At first glance, it looks pretty dangerous to play with a backward pawn like this with a little bit, one might say, misplaced bishop on g6. Well, don't worry about this one. After castles, bishop f4, castle, rook b8, queen c7, we just go with a game like this, and this is Bologan against Adams. Bologan played bishop g5. I found 5 more games in the base like this, capturing, playing rook d8, and wants to play d6. Wants to play d6 to equalize the game. Now white has to stop that. Plays knight e4, brought the knight back to f5, played queen b7, threatening on b2, and in mutual, like cleaning position, eventually ended in a draw. Bologan against Adams, YKZ 2004. We've seen all the lines and all the possibilities with the queen b3. Time for the next move, knight bd2. Knight bd2 is Ivanchuk's specialty. A point of knight bd2 is to defend on c4, and if possible, to go with e4. I also remember that Grandmaster Ivan Ishevich from Serbia used to massively apply this knight bd2 with great successes for white. Although after knight bd2, I believe that it's absolutely the best and easiest approach with bishop b4. I applied it against Grandmaster Rajkovic like 20 years ago. I was winning, but we eventually drew the game. But it's nice, it's simple for playing. What's the point of bishop b4? I open up the back rank, I want to play castle, and at the same time I want to take on c4. And now you have to defend it. Queen c2, you're not only defending pawn on c4, but you also threaten to push e4 and get a center. That's why bishop here, bishop g2, and right before you play short castle and go with e4, I stick my bishop on e4 and harass your queen with tempo. Here I gotta show you two games. Topalov against Adams and Sakaev against Adams. Both of these games were beautiful, and both of these games are model games how to play. Topalov in the game against Adams played queen d1. That was Dortmund 1999. Michael Adams captured. Topalov captures by queen, which means that he wants to play b3 and bishop b2 most likely, or a3. Castles, and a5. The point of a5, first of all, I have to tell you and give you one explanation about having this bishop on e4. Anytime they move the knight, we should happily trade the light square bishops off for their bishop. That's always preferable for black, way more than for white. So keep that in mind and don't forget about it. Second thing, when you play a5, you just simply want to avoid expansion by white coat with b4. And after b3, Michael Adams went with the a4. Bishop a3, d6, knight bd7, played rook e8, and watch this out. The guy played bishop f8. Many times you'll see moves such as bishop f1 and bishop h3. Then they want to move the knight and they want to play f3 and d4. Because of that, we gotta bring the bishop back. We gotta play any f3 with the idea e4. We have to play d5, avoiding this e4 idea and just fighting in the center like this. After queen c2, we just have to play c5, c takes d4, queen c7, with the idea of e5 and d4. That's exactly what happened in this game. Played d4, jumped with the knight on c5, and Topalov got destroyed. A beautiful game by Adams, because after queen d1, bishop d2, queen d2, castles, a5, a4, d6, knight bd7, it's a little bit unusual. I mean, all these moves are just classic. And now he goes rook e8 and pinning himself from some pin. Going with the idea of bishop b7, so he doesn't want to give him f3 and d4 with tempo. Those who play knight h4, they want to go f3 and d4 with tempo. When you play bishop b7, you just say nobody. If you play f3 to go with e4, then I'll play d5, and he won't be able to go with e5. So it's so nice, and that's a very nice model game. After knight bd2, bishop b4, queen c2, bishop b7, bishop g2, bishop e4, queen b3 is absolutely what I faced in all my games so far. They just threaten the bishop. You take, they take, you play castle, and you play d6. And now they all go with rook f to d1. An idea is of placing these rooks to d1 and c1. You go knight bd7, they go rook a c1, and you go rook to e8. An idea of rook e8 is highly prophylactic. I want to break at some point with e5. If I ever break with d5, I want to be able to recapture by pawn, and e5 will be mine. And it's more like prophylaxis. Take a look at the following game. It's one of my most favorite games in the system. Sakaev against Michael Adams. Sakaev played bishop e1. Makes perfect sense. Bringing it back, opening up the rooks, and after queen e7, played queen to a3. The point of this move is that sometimes they want to go g4, g5. a5 also stops before. That was another point of having the queen on e3, especially supported by the bishop on e1 before should be threatened here, so a5. And after bishop f1, they just want to move the knight and afterwards play with f3 and take the center. Bishop e7, knight h4, and this is what I applied in my game against Grandmaster Rajkovic. Queen f8, and now you see that I possibly could have something regarding the x-rays. After queen d3, e5, that's another point of having the rook on e8. d5, a beautiful repositioning of the pieces. Goes with the knight into the center, repositioning his light square bishop because it does nothing on b7 anymore, and now it goes in full activity. And here Michael Adams showed his true class. I don't know what would I play here. I don't know. You can pause the video and ask yourself what would be your plan, but for sure, I guess you won't guess his move. And even if you guess it, maybe you wouldn't fully understand his idea. It's king h8, with the idea of bringing the knight back to g8. After bishop f2, knight g8, e4, knight e7. He now controls f5. He wants to go with g6 and f5. This guy plays like this. Michael Adams captures. And once again, you can pause the video and ask yourself, because I would say, oof, am I worse in this position because he's got a bishop here? But okay, position is relatively closed. So after g6, f takes, h takes, king g7, queen h8, queen h5, and broke with e4. Take a look at this position from that almost, like I'd say, not very perspective game for black. He went into this. Queen e5, threatening both of these pawns. And after bishop f4, queen f5, bishop d7, rook a b8, and b5, Adams had an amazing initiative, and they eventually won the game. And there is another game where after rook e8, they play bishop h3. Well, I should ask you here, so guys, what should be the point of bishop h3 and how do we play there? The point is, move the knight somewhere to h4 preferably, or knight goes back to e1, and play f3 followed by e4, fighting against this annoying bishop. Once again, I'm just going to remind you of the fact that exchanging the light square bishop for the light square bishop should always be in black's advantage. After bishop h3, queen e7, bishop e3, a5, knight e2, bishop e7, queen c2, c5, d takes, b takes, f3, h6, bishop f2, knight e5, bishop g2, knight c6, threatening knight e4, e5, and this is what I like about Michael Adams and his games. Somehow he's so good at maneuvering, and he destroyed Dao Tianhao from Vietnam. Take a look at the game. Queen d2 plays bishop c6. By now you learned that it's aimed against both knight e5 and knight b5. Playing a4, slowly but surely creating a pressure against the pawn, because you won't be able, when I double my rooks on the b file, you won't be able to get rid of that weakness with b3. So after rook d3, queen b7, full flexibility, having some sort of pressure against f3. Rook a6, so he can go with this rook onto the 6th rank and tripling the pieces. He won the pawn. And now you even see another point of having the rook on a6 defending on d6. By the way, he can't take on d6 because in that case, he would be just lost because we take on e2. And after e4, he just played queen b8 and defended everything. And once again, I somehow admire to this guy because his positional chess and his ideas are so resourceful. Look at this. White played g4. We can practically say that he goes for all in. He wants to play h4 and kick that knight away. Maybe he wants to play bishop h4 as well. He played knight h7, and the message is clear. No more g5. The guy plays h4 and says, sooner or later I'm going to do it. Michael Adams goes knight f8 and says, nobody. You seem not to understand me. So this, g5, playing knight e6, threatening the pawn, playing g6, and after knight e4, bishop c6, rook b6, king g7, and rook h8, Michael Adams was completely winning. He was up a pawn, and these guys, his bishops, absolutely didn't work. Beautiful games, beautiful approach, and just like I said, sometimes you should analyze and learn your chess through the model games. Let's go on to the next move. Next move is queen a4. Of all the openings and all the variations against the Queen's Indian with bishop a6, this one I probably hate the most because I played 7 tournament games and made 7 draws. And do you know what's the fun part? I've never in problems, but even funnier, I never could have win my games. So after like bishop b7, bishop g2, c5, d takes, bishop takes, castles, knight c3. Watch out. One guy played in blitz d6 and after b4 lost a bishop and resigned the game. That's why we first play bishop e7 and after rook d1 we now go with knight a6. Point of knight a6 is to go with this knight on c5 harassing the queen, and then you just want to move your queen onto the c8 and onto the c file to pressure potentially c4. After like bishop f4, knight c5, queen c2, queen c8. I remember when I analyzed this, being younger, I played even 3 tournament games. I put them into the file. Don't forget, if you ever want to get this file, just drop me an email on miodrag.perunovic@gmail.com. So after queen c8, look at my game against Grandmaster Arsovic. He played rook ac1. I played knight c on e4. The point of queen c8 here is defending the bishop, removing the queen from the threats, and going with knight c on e4, in which case we would have a very nice pressure against the c4 pawn. After like rook ac1, knight c on e4, knight to d4, you gotta take. I played a6, jump with the knight on e4, played f5, and when he played knight b3, threatening my piece, I played bishop c6, and my opponent with white pieces forced a draw. We agreed on a draw. On queen c8, rook d4 is the main move, d5, and main theoretical approach is rook c1. I'll show you what to do. But everybody goes this, and play knight g5, threatening mate on h7 and threatening the bishop. Don't panic, it's nothing. You take, they take, you go bishop g2, they go king g2, check, playing e5, playing e4, and in a game like this, just like you see, I made a draw against Arsovic. I just played rook d5, he played rook c8, I played like this, he brought it back to c4, and once again against the same guy, just 7 years later, I played the same line. He played, but you know, like I'm also disappointed with that kind of approach. The guy with the white pieces didn't even have an ambition to beat me within a range of 7 years with the same line in a boring opening with white pieces. That's a wrong approach. Don't play chess like that. So after queen c2, queen c8, rook to d4, d5, rook c1. Everybody plays that. Then you play knight c on e4, pressuring something in the center, pressuring c4. D takes c4, kicking the knight away, and playing h6. Point is you want to go with some g5 at some point, and you also want to avoid bishop g5 followed by bishop f6 and some knight d7 ideas. After like rook dd1, bishop c5, a5 securing the position of the bishop, and after a3 played a4, which basically he was threatening before, so a4, rook d8, exchanging the pieces, playing bishop e7 so he can play rook to d8, and just like you see, they drew the game afterwards. We're left 2 more lines, and hopefully so far I'm just successfully solving your problems with the Queen's Indian. 2 more lines that we're talking about are absolutely the main possibilities. The most popular thing nowadays is queen c2, and we have a classic b3. Let me just first show you b3, and we're gonna end this lecture with the most popular and the main move nowadays. It's queen c2. It's a gambit variation where you just have to learn your lines, otherwise you can get killed. What do we do against b3? They just defend, but they weaken the dark squares. We play bishop b4, bishop d2. Do you know that the bishop d2 is the only move? Can you guess how should you carry on with initiative after knight b2? You play bishop c3, threatening the rook. You play bishop b7, threatening bishop d4 because knight is hanging as well as rook. He can't play bishop g2 because of this. Played bishop b2, knight e4, and now when we stick our knight on e4, defend the bishop, they can't touch it. Now I'm threatening to, for example, knight d2, and take on h1. So after rook g1, played queen f6, and now we threaten to take on d2, in which case queen f2 should be made because you cannot recapture by knight. So some very nice tricks, and that's a good thing to learn. After bishop b4, bishop d2, bishop e7, and in early knight c3, early, you play castle, and after e4, you just break it like this. One thing you have to remember here, how should we play these positions? Well, play c5, put the queen on d7 and d6, put the knight on c6, and play with this hanging pawns. Position is very powerful. This is the game Karpov against Wishy and Anand won. After queen e2, played knight c3, played queen d7 to avoid a6, played queen e6. The worst blocking piece in chess is the queen, but he didn't care so much because after queen e6, he's just controlling everything. He can't go with the knight and chase that queen away with any of these knight e4 ideas. So after knight g1, knight c6, he first played e4, captured by bishop, launched the attack, and crushed Karpov. Apart from that, if they go with the knight c3, castle, bishop g2, we just go with c6, and any e4, you just have to break with e5. Listen to me. Any e4, you gotta break with e5. You can't sit and wait. So after bishop e4, bishop d2, bishop e7, bishop g2, we go c6. And when they go with bishop c3, if they go castle, you just go d5. That's why we played c6. But another point of having the c6 is fighting with this very powerful pawn chain stretched from h7 to a7. And we simply lock the activity of the light square bishop. Queen c7, knight bd7, fast rook c8 with either short castle or fast c5. If bishop c3, you play d5, and makes perfect sense because now the bishop on c3 looks stupid. They have two ideas. They have an idea that it's knight bd2, and they have a classic one with knight e5. Those who play knight bd2, you play knight bd7. They go castle, castle, rook e1, and they want to go with e4 at all costs. Now I'm about to teach you something. You play c5, undermining the center. They go e4. A very important rule about these positions is that you should never take on e4, because any kind of middle game like that, even though engine says it's maybe tiny bit better for white, in practice, it's almost undefendable from black's point of view. So after e4, you can play what I played, like this, and when they take by pawn, you take on d4 and absolutely crush every single piece in their game. They go knight e6, threatening the knight, taking bishop c5, threatening on f2, queen to d3, kind of paralyzing this guy, and position is fine for black. We're down a pawn, we can always get it back, and position is really with a huge amount of compensation for us. But when you play and they take by knight, you just have to go with bishop b7, threatening the pawn on e4. This is my tournament game against Stojagic, FIDE Master 2315. So if they go with e5, you go on knight e5, and I have full control of the game. The point of rook c8 is to go with b5 and c4 and go after the knight and to create a passer. Another thing is that after bishop b7, some guys play queen to d3, defending the center. Queen c7, rook f to d8, rook a to c8, and this is Ivanchuk's game, just like you see, he demolished Kish and won the game afterwards. And finally, if e5, you just play knight e5. I explained you play rook c8, followed by b5 and c4. Okay, I mean, all these lines are just fine, but absolutely the main move is knight e5. So after knight e5, we play knight f to d7. It's very important to do knight f to d7 and not to forget that we cannot play knight bd7 because they will simply take the pawn on c6. So you can't play knight bd7, but you play knight f to d7. Knight f to d7, it's challenging the knight, and c6 is defended. Knight d7, knight d7, knight e2, castles, castles. And here, out of so many theoretical moves, such as c5, rook b8, rook c8, whatever, I chose to teach you and to show you two very important games. By black, one is Kramnik-Anand, and another one is Carlsen when he was very young. And I just want to teach you how to trade these positions. So what's the point? Let me show you Kramnik and end. Rook c1, knight f6, bishop d6, repositioning these pieces, queen e7, rook a c8 over protecting c6, rook f to d8, went with the queen e8, and played g5. And just like you see, Anand crushed Kramnik in this game. Anand was black. And I really like this game. He wants to play g4, wants to reposition that queen, maybe wants to play knight h7, knight g5, maybe immediately knight e4. Black was just great and won the game. After f5, they can play a4. You reposition your knight to a better place. And when they go, for example, Grandmaster Nagy went against Asipenko with queen c2, rook c8, fighting against that queen on c2 with some x-rays when you play c5, e3, knight e4, jumping with a knight. He can barely fight with this knight, and that's why this guy captured. Then you take by f-pawn, opening f-file, going with the queen e8 and queen g6, rook f6, rook c on f8, h5 with the idea h4, just like you see, all our pieces should go against the hyper solid pawn structure for this guy. And finally, if knight f6, a5, you go with a very lovely b5 move. So when they play c5, you go with very lovely b4, this one, and after bishop c3, you go with another lovely thing with g5. After knight f3, knight e4, defending on g5, bishop f6, queen c7, rook b5, knight c5, and they drew the game because this was correspondence game, but in tournament chess, I believe that white is gonna hardly defend this type of games. If queen c2, so if not any c takes b5 or c5, you just take, play rook c8 or play c5, playing c5, challenging that queen, and after like d takes, knight e5, bishop c5, he was winning and eventually won the game. So just like you see, I showed you absolutely all the possibilities and moves, and it's time for g3, bishop a6, and simply queen c2. I already explained you, we moved the queen from d1. When the queen is not on d1, they cannot push d5. So we play c5, hoping that the queen on c2 cannot support the d5 idea as well. That's true, but now he plays the gambit. And that's why this variation became so popular. I played with white pieces and won most of my games. So after e takes, bishop b7, bishop g2. I found one picture where the guy, found one game where the guy went with e4, but I meant to say it's a nice picture because after e4, queen e7, going after the queen on e1, both of these pawns, bishop or knight d5, are pawn on e4, and they're just a lot worse. So after bishop g2, you take by knight, castles, and knight c6. I remember when I was younger, rook d1. I played this move, bishop e7, because I remember that they couldn't take on d5. Simply, we just play knight b4, winning the rook back, and we're completely winning. So after like bishop e7, they have 4 moves. Rook d5 doesn't work because of this. They can go with queen f5. Queen f5 is dangerous. Pressuring f7, pressuring d7, knight on d5. But when you play knight f6, now all of a sudden it looks pretty cool for us. Thing about this one is that they can't now fight against f7 and d7. Played g6, played castle, played knight h5, and Dak against Ding Liren lost. Queen c4, queen c7, threatening here. Bishop h6, knight a5, rook e8, rook ad8, and just like you see, Ding Liren played a very logical game. He grabbed the pawn and eventually managed to defend himself. Instead of queen f5, another line is queen a4. That's a line where he obviously threatens to take on d5. You bring it back, knight h4 to go with knight f5, g6 to avoid knight f5, bishop h6 to threaten bishop g7 or whatever, but your position looks very dubious if you don't know what to do. So you just want to get rid of that bishop. You just get rid of that bishop, and now you have problems with the d5 square. After like long castles, g5, a6, b5, and queen a6, looks like that in a game like this, Black has very lovely. Okay, we have to say and to admit that white is the one who's got a compensation because we're up a pawn. But I absolutely don't see any problems. I even see this pawn majority 4 against 2 on the queen side. I even see some c4, bishop, c5 ideas. Black just looks amazing. And after queen c2, c5, they gambit a pawn. You take by knight, and here you play a3. Once again, they threaten to take, in which case you wouldn't have this knight before idea going against both queen and rook on d5. So he has to go back here. Knight c3 castles, bishop f4, knight e6. You will rarely find positions where you give up the center. Here you're giving up on d5, you know, like for the d5 square, but we're up a pawn. So this guy played e3. He was very satisfied to play down a pawn, but I don't know. I don't see anything here. d6, h6, queen c8, rook d8, exchanged like everything, and they just drew the game, and that's a nice game for the draw. Guys, just like you see, I tried to show you so many different lines tonight to teach you like lots of really interesting positions and stuff, and hopefully you enjoyed in this one. Having a lecture like this is not easy, almost for 1.5 hours. I tried to present you all the most important model games and ideas, and hopefully you enjoyed the lecture. Just one last thing. This was a special gift for Carl Pottinger, Don Carlito AK, and hopefully he's gonna have lots of great results with this system. Queen's Indian for black with bishop a6 simply rules. Bye bye, guys.